Well, hello, it's your old mate Dave Spencer. This time I'm speaking on behalf of the Online Transport Archive, the OTA. And the OTA is there as a registered charity to preserve for posterity moving and still images, particularly of transport. Back in the 1980s, 90s, Martin Jenkins, who's the chair of the OTA now, Martin worked with Wilf Waters producing a series of over 100 VHS videos. And we thought it'd be rather pleasant to ask if Martin and Wilf minded if we could take the ownership of the copyright on these on board with the OTA, and they kindly agreed for that. And Martin's still very much active in the field. He's chairman of the OTA. So with that in mind, and they raised in the past money for tramway restoration, well, we're hoping to raise some money eventually for the OTA and the upkeep of all this old and sometimes fragile material. So they're doing a wonderful job, and this time we're going to bring you their first part of the look at Blackpool trams. There's something a bit strange at the beginning. I'm not really sure what's happened there, and there was a sort of bit of glitching on it, but I think we might have lost a few seconds at the start. But given the fact it lasts an hour and a half, I don't think that's going to be much of a hardship. I've cleaned them up as best I can and brought them up to high definition standards, so they should be suitable for a modern audience. So meanwhile, sit back, enjoy, and I'll perhaps catch up with you at the end. Enjoy.
Situated on the Lancashire coast, between Morecambe Bay and the mouth of the River Ribble, the borough of Blackpool is one of the most popular resorts in England. Every year, come hail or shine, thousands of day trippers and holiday makers flock to the town to enjoy the miles of beaches, the bracing air, the three piers, the theatres and dance halls, and other centres of entertainment. And in the late autumn, the world-famous Illuminations. The resort also boasts two other unique attractions. Firstly, its superb Victorian tower, rising 519 feet into the sky, which in 1994 celebrated its 100th anniversary. And secondly, the oldest electric tramway in Britain, parts of which by September of 1995 will have been in continuous operation for 110 years. To mark the tramway's centenary, a series of superb events was held during 1985. Amongst the vintage vehicles on display were several representing different stages in the development of the system. Pride of place was given to a diminutive four-wheeler, number 4, the only survivor of a mixed fleet of 10 vehicles which had operated Britain's first electric tramway. The original line, built in 1885 by the Blackpool Electric Tramways Company, had run approximately 2 miles, from the entrance to Claremont Park southwards to Dean Street, close to Victoria, now South Pier. Utilising the conduit method of current collection, by which power was drawn from a slot between the running rails by means of a plough mounted under the tram, the line was officially opened on the 29th of September 1885. Unfortunately, the company failed to maintain the system satisfactorily, the centre rail being frequently blocked by sand and water, With the result, it rapidly gained a reputation for being unreliable. By the time of the corporation takeover in 1892, things had deteriorated to such a level that horse cars had been substituted. However, after a thorough overhaul supervised by the system's inventor, Holroyd Smith, extensions were built in 1895 to South Shore Station on Lytham Road and from Dean Street to Victoria Pier, followed in 1897 by a short line along Station Road, bringing the conduit system to its maximum extent. Starting in June 1899, the tramway was converted to the overhead method of current collection. Gas, as well as horse-powered trams, ran from South Shore Station along Lytham Road into St Anne's and were operated by an independent company, which leased the tracks within the Blackpool boundary from the corporation. These gas cars are on Clifton Drive. When the tramway serving Lytham and St Anne's was electrified in 1903, two former Blackpool conduit cars, numbers 1 and 5, were hired by the company, and both are seen here at Lytham. Number 5 was eventually converted into a works car and used for towing trailers with rails and cable drums for the engineering department. Number 4, today's survivor, was decorated for the 20th anniversary of the tramway in 1905. During the First World War, it transported bread to the troops encamped at Squires Gate. Withdrawn as a works car in 1934, it languished, almost forgotten, until making a dramatic reappearance in 1960. By 1985, it had been restored to its original condition, and to simulate conduit operation was powered by batteries. At the turn of the century, the electric network was set to expand rapidly. Probably the most significant extension was that to Ginn Square, opened in May 1900, which not only ran into the developing north end of the town, but also served the independent Blackpool and Fleetwood Tramroad Company, whose 8¼ mile line had been opened in 2 stages during 1898. The mile of track from Talbot Road Station to the Ginn being leased from the corporation by the company. 3 depots, of which only Copse Road Fleetwood survives today, house the company's eventual fleet of 41 cars. 2 former company vehicles are still in existence, both having served for many years as works cars. Built by G.F. Milnes of Birkenhead on plate-frame trucks, number 2 is representative of the Tramroad's 16 48 cross-bench cars delivered in 1898-9, of which 3 originated as trailers. They were known by the staff as the racks or old opens. During 1904-05, the promenade between Talbot Square and South Shore was completely rebuilt, incorporating a paved but unfenced tramway reservation on the seaward side of the carriageway. This far-sighted development probably safeguarded the long-term future of Blackpool's Promenade tramline. A protective sea wall was constructed. Previously, the sand had come right up to the tracks, causing major problems during stormy weather. The original short-bracketed side and centre poles were replaced by long side bracket arms. As these sequences graphically illustrate, the work was labour-intensive, involving hundreds of men, wagons and horses. The rebuilt section was opened in April 1905. To operate the town routes, 2 batches of double-deckers entered service during 1901. 27 to 41 were 78-seaters, built by the Midland Railway Carriage and Wagon Company and were known as the Martin boxcars. whilst the Motherwells 42 to 53 were also 78-seaters, but these were maximum traction bogie cars built by the Scottish firm Hearst Nelson. By 1914, both groups had been top-covered. Gradually, the poor-riding single truckers were lengthened and mounted on new bogies. Three types of car entered service during 1911. The deluxe top-covered standards comprised 62 to 64, originally four-wheelers but later retrucked on bogies, while 65 to 68 were 76-seaters delivered on equal-wheel bogies. To counter competition from the growing charabanc trade, 69 to 92 were 69-seater toast racks mounted on Maguire trucks. Like the deluxe standards, they were built by the United Electric Car Company, the first entering service during the 1911 August bank holiday, with deliveries continuing until 1914. Used primarily on the circular tour, running to and from Talbot Square via the Promenade, Station Road and Whitegate Drive, in hot weather, a ride on a toast rack was an essential part of any visit to Blackpool. Here, members of the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company are seen alighting at the pleasure beach in the 1920s. Note the centrally positioned destination box. Is the wonderfully exuberant individual in the white coat a member of the company or a tramway employee? Making its only sortie into the second-hand market, the corporation purchased 6 high-capacity London United cars in 1919, these being urgently needed to cater for the growing promenade traffic. On the 1st of January 1920, the corporation acquired the assets of the Tramroad Company for £300,000, the two systems being linked at both Talbot Road Station and Ginn Square. The enclosed vehicles became 101 to 115 and the assorted open racks 116 to 141, all being gradually repainted in the Blackpool livery of red and cream. Following reconstruction of the promenade between Cocker Street and the Ginn to include a paved tramway reservation, the layout at the Ginn itself was redesigned in April 1924 to include a siding and a crossover on the north side. Once new bullhead rail with angled check rail had been laid, double-deckers were permitted to operate over the old company route, first to Cabin in 1924, followed by Bispam in 1926. Finally, the Lytham St Anne's Corporation trams were extended to terminate at the Ginn in 1926, making it one of the busiest locations on the system. Crowds returned to the resort after the Great War, one of the biggest attractions being the American-style amusement park at the Pleasure Beach. This family-owned enterprise celebrates its centenary in 1996. Having walked or arrived by tram at the impressive 4-track terminus, there was always plenty of rail-operated activity inside the fairground to interest the visiting enthusiast. Ships again plied for trade from North Pier. A local favourite in the early 20s was the twin-screw steamer Robina, which had been launched in Scotland in 1914. She had a long and varied career, spending time at Blackpool during the 1919 and 1923 four seasons, and was eventually scrapped in 1953. For the 1925 season, the corporation also revived the Promenade illuminations, introduced in 1912 but suspended following the outbreak of the First World War. Special illuminated trams had appeared intermittently since 1897, but up until 1925, various passenger cars have been fitted with thousands of bulbs. For example, Deluxe Standard 68, a role it continued to play until withdrawn in 1936. The first purpose-built illuminated trams were the gondola, dating from 1925, and the lifeboat from 1926, both of which incorporated the truck and body frames from old Martin boxcars. With an extra 1 million passengers generating over £7,000 worth of additional revenue, the future of the illuminations was guaranteed. In October 1926, the new South Promenade was opened, running from Clifton Drive in the south to the Pleasure Beach. Incorporated was an impressive double-track paved tramway reservation. The total cost for the 1.5 miles of roadway, tramway and sunken gardens was £320,000. To fully exploit this new extension, a connection was laid along Star Gate during the summer of 1928 to provide a link with the junction of Clifton Drive North and Squires Gate Lane. This enabled Lytham St Anne's Corporation to run 2 services to Ginn Square via either Squires Gate Lane or the new South Promenade. It also became possible to make the 16-mile journey from Lytham to Fleetwood with just a change of car at Ginn Square. In April 1932, the circular tour was revised to run via Squires Gate Lane, and in 1938 the cramped stub terminal at Stargate was replaced by the existing loop. Fleet alterations and additions included the conversion of 6 Yanks into glass houses when they were totally enclosed and re-trucked. Another star of the 1985 celebrations was number 40. This represented the corporation's fleet of 78-seater standards, of which 55 entered service between 1923 and 1929. 7 were built by Hearst Nelson, the remainder by the corporation, of which 26 were brand new, whilst 22 were classified as rebuilds. The latter did incorporate parts from scrap cars, and the old-style Tudor-arched windows helped appease cost-conscious councillors. Vestibules first appeared in 1929, and starting in 1930, 17 of the cars were eventually to be totally enclosed for winter use on the Martin route. The toast rack fleet was strengthened in 1927 with arrival of 6 small 64-seaters built by the corporation on standard car frames. When modernised in 1936, a centre gangway was cut through the benches in order to prevent accidents involving conductors swinging along the open sides. All toast racks were stored in 1939, the older examples being scrapped. But 161 to 166, although never used again in passenger service, survived to fulfil other functions, as will be seen later. Eventually, in 1972, 166 went to the National Tramway Museum. 167 also went to the Tramway Museum, but 10 years earlier in 1962. Seen here in 1985 during Fleetwood Tram Sunday, it was one of a group of 10 Pullman cars delivered in 1928 to replace the aging tramroad saloons on the trunk Blackpool Fleetwood service. Built by the English Electric Company on Preston Maguire bogies, they were fitted with upholstered 2x2 seating, air brakes and powerful 50-horsepower motors. These attractive American-style vehicles were the first cars to sport trolley or, in this case, pantograph towers. Despite receiving trolley poles in 1933, these distinctive cars were always referred to as the pantographs. In January 1933, Walter Luff was appointed as manager. Within months of his arrival, he had presented a 5-year plan of reconstruction aimed at increasing passengers and revenue. To compete with the modern bus, streamlined trams were ordered. Based on number 200, a prototype designed for the overseas market, a further 44 English electric rail coaches were delivered in 2 batches between 1933 and 1935. Each had upholstered seating for 48 passengers, modern trucks, motors and controllers, clocks, heaters and twin sliding sunshine roofs. Costing £2,000 each, the new cream and green cars were an instant success. The modern tram had finally arrived. Complementing the rail coaches were 3 further groups of English Electric built cars. 225 to 236 were 56-seater luxury toast racks intended for seasonal work. Delivered during 1934-5, they were equipped with controllers from withdrawn cars, and owing to their nautical appearance, were swiftly dubbed the boats. .237 to 249 were 94-seater luxury dreadnoughts, again intended for seasonal operation. Delivered during 1934, they had English Electric 2x57 horsepower motors and Z6 controllers to allow for fast running on the tram road. Steel shutter blinds sealed off the top deck in poor weather. The delivery of these open-top balloons led to withdrawal of the dreadnoughts by the winter of 1934. .250 to .263 were 84-seater totally enclosed balloons, which were delivered in 1934-5. .284 to .303, the 20 brush-built rail coaches delivered in 1937, differed in having driver-operated power doors, EMB hornless bogies, Crompton-Parkinson motors and Allen West controllers. As part of the 5-year plan, the Leighton and Central Drive services were replaced by buses in October 1936, releasing many elderly cars for scrap. Sadly, visions of single-deck streamliners speeding between Fleetwood and St Anne's Square were shattered when plans for Blackpool to take over the track along Clifton Drive North were rejected. The last Lytham-St Anne's trams operating on the 28th of April 1937. The track along Squaresgate Lane, owned by Lytham St Anne's, was retained for use by the popular circular tour. To facilitate withdrawal of the last tramroad stock, 12 summer-only Sun Saloons were delivered by English Electric in 1939. 10 to 21 were semi-open, with folding soft roofs in the centre. To cut costs, they had motors and controllers from scrapped cars. Luff's transformation of the tramway was curtailed following the outbreak of war. Overall, the system coped admirably with the extra demands imposed during the hostilities. But the illuminations and the circular tour using Stargate were suspended, and many older cars were scrapped to release valuable space, although the Lytham depot on Squaresgate Lane remained wired for emergency use. One post-war change was the closure, as from April 1949, of the unprofitable coal transshipments between Fleetwood and the mineral sidings at Thornton Gate. These had started in April 1927 as a direct response to a threat to build a branch line railway to Cleveleys, a move which Blackpool believed could jeopardise its monopoly on the tram road. When the coal movements ended, the sidings and the electric locomotive were put to other uses. The small but powerful four-wheel steeple cab now spent its time at Copse Road, Fleetwood, being used by the engineering department until withdrawn and dispatched to the National Tramway Museum in 1966, where it has since been restored to original condition. At the end of the war, the crowds quickly returned, and like other resorts, Blackpool revelled in this sudden boom in traffic. The switching on of the illuminations in 1949 also helped dispel post-war gloom. Joining the familiar gondola and lifeboat was a new illuminated car, Progress, although in fact it had made an appearance in the 1937-8 illuminations as the bandwagon. An added attraction for some was the playing of tape music. The cut-out silhouettes in the windows did deceive some people into believing it was in fact a real double-decker and not an old tramroad toast rack. 1951 colour views of the illuminated fleet. Here the four-wheel lifeboat plunges and rolls along the wavy track. At this point, the gondola and the lifeboat did not carry fare-paying passengers, only invited guests. Under Luff, Progress was indeed to be the order of the day. With the war over, he was determined to test the latest in tramway technology by relaying the Martin route and replacing the traditional standards with modern fast and silent rail coaches, which would utilize equipment similar to that employed in the American PCC. The town council only approved the necessary expenditure by the narrowest margin. Following various experiments with PCC-style trucks and equipment, it was decided to save money by upgrading the 12 Sun saloons. These had been totally enclosed during the war to carry troops. However, owing to their Spartan interiors, they were dubbed cattle trucks. Now they emerge with modernized saloons, resilient wheeled trucks, 4 45-horsepower motors, and variable automatic multi-notch braking and acceleration control, or the Vanback system, the equipment being housed in the base of the trolley tower. Unfortunately, they were insufficient to cover all duties, so some of the earlier rail coaches were required. Amongst them was 208, which, as part of Luff's experimental work, had received inside frame trucks, high-speed motors and Vanback controls in 1946. Regular standard duties on the Martin route ceased in 1954, the survivors being relegated to seasonal extras, although 21 were also broken up between 1951 and 1954. At this point, the remaining 16 seemed destined for an early demise. A question mark also hung over the future of the balloons. Even though the 12 open toppers had been totally enclosed during the war, it was rumoured they too could be scrapped, following delivery of a new fleet of 8-foot-wide, ultra-modern PCC-style rail coaches. Luff favoured single-deckers, arguing they were cheaper all round, safer, and they reduced staffing levels. To operate a double shift with 20 double-deckers required 120 crew, whereas the same number could man 30 single-deckers. Built to railway standards by Charles Roberts of Wakefield, the first of the 50-foot-long steel-frame streamliners entered service in June 1952, receiving as much attention as a Hollywood film star. The luxurious 56-seaters, being superbly appointed, were quickly christened the Spivs by the platform staff. This led the management to issue an instruction that they must only be known as the Coronations, after the royal event of June 1953. Like the revamped Martin cars, they also had inside-frame resilient wheeled trucks, high-speed motors and Vanback controls. For several years, any track relaying had taken account of the possible introduction of 8-foot-wide trams. Unfortunately, the 25 Coronations were to prove an enormous drain on resources. Their total cost had soared to over £300,000, rising to £500,000 with the loan charges. The full story of their long drawn-out demise will be told in Blackpool Trams Part 2. All the pantographs except 167 had received the trucks from the rebuilt Sun saloons, but outwardly they looked decidedly old-fashioned, alongside the state-of-the-art Coronations. Since the mid-30s, the 10 cars had worked only during the season on their traditional back road route to North Station. Following delivery of the Coronations, the deluxe toast racks rarely ventured beyond Little Bispam. By boat, to the boat. In these 1952 scenes, passengers are ferried to Fleetwood to connect with an Isle of Man sailing to Douglas. Note the decorations in the trolley tower. "225", the prototype boat, Little Willie, prepares to pick up passengers heading back into Blackpool. The predominantly cream livery carried by the coronations now began to displace the wartime green on the rail coaches. The pantographs, which sported 4 different liveries during their existence, retained their wartime garb until scrapped. The coronations assumed all-year responsibility for the Fleetwood Stargate service in the 50s. The repainting of the rail coaches took until 1955. However, the last green balloon would survive until 1959. Double-deckers rarely operated beyond Little Bispam Loop, seen here, and never through to Fleetwood until 1958. This former open-top balloon is on the Squires Gate and Airport service, which at this point was running to and from Little Bispam. A mixture of liveries passing Norbreck Hydro. This coronation is in virtually original condition. The end of each season saw further inroads into the ranks of the standards. For example, 99 was released for scrap at the end of the 1954 season. Suddenly, however, the future of the double-deckers became more secure when Walter Luff was succeeded by J.C. Franklin in July 1954. Franklin inherited 17 miles of tramway, 155 miles of bus routes, and a mixed fleet of 166 trams and 191 buses, making it one of the largest municipal undertakings in the country. But he also inherited a major financial crisis. A shocked council discovered that for the first time its buses and trams would make a loss. The rise in car ownership, coupled with the advent of television, meant fewer riders and therefore less revenue. Cost-cutting measures were essential. At the end of the 1954 illuminations, Marton Depot was closed for the winter, the local service being transferred to Rigby Road, although the depot was used to store the hibernating seasonal fleet. Eight standards were returned to work Promenade specials, and these included balcony car number 40. A decision was also taken to maximize seasonal usage of the big double-deckers. A view of a balloon on a rare working from Cleveland's taken in 1954, several years before their regular extension of usage to Fleetwood. As if marking rescue from years of neglect, 259 sported a brighter, more inviting paint scheme. Franklin was later to admit that he knew the 3 street tramways would eventually have to be abandoned in order to safeguard the long-term future of the promenade route. Closure would also alleviate the need for replacing life-expired track and cars. The heavy coronations, weighing in at 20 tons, were already proving costly to operate and maintain. Franklin did consider laying them up during the winter, but he realized that this would be politically unacceptable. He did, however, reduce the overall number of trams, including seasonal extras, during the summer months. A dewirement outside the former company depot at Bowl Street, Fleetwood. Franklin's decision to retain the balloons was based on their massive carrying capacity. Although the future of the Lytham Road service was already in doubt, plans to widen the road and relay the tracks were still being evaluated as late as 1955. During the 50s, the Blackpool trams appeared to enjoy something of an Indian summer, although each year saw a further drop in passengers and revenue, which led to a more hard-headed approach to their financial viability. This resulted in a number of changes. For example, the attractive green flares and V's began to disappear after the winter of 1954-5. Many of the chrome fittings were gradually removed or reduced when replacement panels were installed. The cost-effectiveness of the Martin route was also placed under a microscope. Residents were enjoying a frequent, cheap level of service with comfortable, silent trams, but the ratio of staff to passengers on an essentially moderately trafficked suburban line meant it was increasingly subsidized by receipts from elsewhere. A fare increase was deemed politically unacceptable. At the busy Royal Oak terminus, a loading island was provided in early 1956. During the summer, every third Martin car joined the convoy of trams on Lytham Road to run down to South Pier via Station Road. This provided a very useful source of additional summer revenue. In mid-1956, these balloons still retained their wartime livery. The coronations, with their 4 motors and rapid acceleration, had proved a drain on the electrical distribution system, especially here at the south end, which led to the updating of the feeder supply to avoid power cuts by the Mercury Arc substation at Bond Street. The salt air had all too quickly eroded their chrome and stainless steel embellishments, and these were removed, together with the sliding standee windows. This car is still virtually as built, although it will have new bearings, a fixed trolley head and a shorter trolley arm. When delivered, the bearings had been insufficient for the weight, and swivel trolley heads and the 20-foot trolley arms had resulted in some spectacular dewirements. Harrowside, a regular short working on the South Promenade. When the Pleasure Beach Company allowed construction of the South Promenade across its land, as part of the agreement, it wisely insisted that in future all trams should display Pleasure Beach on their indicators and also make a compulsory stop in both directions. The four-track system of through lines and sidings introduced in 1926 had been replaced by today's two-way loop in 1938 as part of Walter Luff's modernization program. Until the 1960s, all the single-deckers carried chain lights slung from the trolley tower during the period of the illuminations. Manchester Square, with the Lytham road routes feeding onto the promenade. This section northwards to Central Station and Talbot Square was the busiest on the system, with crush loadings during the height of the season, when many additional trams were often manned by student conductors. By 1958, more and more of the fleet were in the various simplified liveries. In the summer, rail coaches from Bispam and balloons from Cabin operated through to Squires Gate on two different services, providing a 5-minute headway. In another minor change, the green panel below the driver's windscreen was painted cream. By 1959, only a handful of balloons remained in green, including 246, which appeared in this not unattractive but unique scheme. Following behind 246 is a sister car, which has been rebuilt with a modified form of destination display, first introduced in 1955. At Ginn Square, cars on the 1, the only tram route to display a service number, headed inland to parallel the promenade and terminate at North, formerly Talbot Road Station. From Easter to October, this was home to the pantographs, of which all 8 passenger cars have been repainted for the 1956 season, but with smaller, less striking fleet numbers. They rarely ventured off the old company route, even spending their winter hibernation in Bispam Depot. They carried no promenade destinations on their indicators. In an attempt to bring them into line with the rail coaches, they had been modernized in the late 1930s, with fitted platform doors, improved windscreens, more streamlined indicator boxes, and a lower trolley tower. These 1954 scenes alongside the miners' home include some of the last rail coaches to carry the wartime green. This was probably brush car 290. Approaching Bispam. Bispam was always a hive of activity, with short working cars, crew changes, and trams moving in and out of the depot, which was reached by means of a single track down Red Bank Road. Note Pooled Hui House in the background. Built in 1898 for the Tramroad Company and extended in 1914, it was always associated with the Fleetwood route, employees in the 50s still referring to it as the other firm. Associated latterly with the pantographs, the brush cars and the English electric rail coaches, it had a capacity for 36 trams on 6 tracks. During the summer of 1959, when these views were taken, the depot had 20 regular duties, divided between the North Station Fleetwood route and Squires Gate Bispam service. Back now to Bispam tram station in the year 1954. It had become a major short working point for the promenade routes following the extension of double-decker operation in 1926. A through car on Route 1 passes on the outside track. Pantographs on the long sweep leading from Little Bispam into Cleveland's. Passing through the roundabout in the centre of Cleveland's. Thornton Gate. The 3-track layout here allowed through service cars to avoid the coal trains. A few redundant trams were to end their days being dismantled on the Thornton Gate sidings during a 6-year period starting in 1958. Coronations on the tramroad. Overlooked by the now demolished Fleetwood power station, a heavily laden pantograph speeds majestically along by Rossall Farm. A real vestige of the old interurban atmosphere at Rossall Lane. At Copse Road was another former tramroad facility. Dating from 1897, it was latterly used as a permanent way store. This coronation has a decorative inlay in the base of its trolley tower. This was the site of the original tramroad terminus. The Fleetwood loop, which dated from 1925, had succeeded in bringing the trams closer to the waterfront, the railway station and the harbour. Adjacent to the loop was the Knot End ferry, which crossed the Wyre Channel. These views show the diesel-powered Calderdale and Loonvale, and on the right the steamer Wyresdale, all since scrapped. Interestingly, the Coronation in the background, 305, was the only one of the class to make one nocturnal adventure onto the Martin route. The railway station handled local as well as boat trains and was a focal point for various local bus services. Determined to exploit the novelty value of the trams, Franklin introduced illumination tours in 1956, and then in the following year he revived the pre-war circular tour. After loading in Talbot Square, the cars edged onto the prom. With the conductor alighting to pull the trailer frog. Sometimes the tour cars and many promenade extras could only leave the depot if sufficient temporary staff were available. The boats ran from Martin Depot, which had many seasonal staff. To reactivate the tour had involved cleaning out some lengths of rail along Stargate and Squiresgate Lane, which had only been recently tarred over. The whole process had intrigued the enthusiasts, who were more used to tracks being abandoned than reopened, but for the general public it was simply a pleasant way of passing an hour on board an open tram. The euphoria proved short-lived, the tour only lasting 4 seasons. This boat is carrying a much simplified livery and a protective driver's windscreen. Back at Talbot Square, and all for 1 3d. Another innovation was the coastal tour, introduced in 1958. This was worked initially by the corporation's first twin set, which had been built in great secrecy following a visit to Zurich to study trailer operation. The twin set was in fact 2 1935 rail coaches, rebuilt to resemble coronations, and linked together in a motorcar trailer formation. The couple set, with accommodation for 114 and a crew of 3, was seen as one answer to the problem of rising staff costs. The council was sufficiently impressed to sanction the purchase of 10 trailers and the conversion of a further 8 rail coaches to towing cars. The coastal tour offered participants a return trip along the full length of the 11-mile coastal tramway for 3 shillings or 15p in today's money. The twin set provides an interesting contrast with the 3-wheel Bonn minicar. Returning from Fleetwood at Rossall. The coastal tour ran to and from Central Station, but as passengers were not allowed to break their journey, it did not prove very popular. Miles of check rail had to be laid before the Ministry of Transport would sanction the operation of double-deckers into Fleetwood. Years later, Ministry officials admitted the check rails were unnecessary and would not have prevented the big cars from overturning. Limited operation to Fleetwood began at Easter 1958, followed by regular use during the summer. The balloons look somewhat cumbersome on the tram road, but with their high seating capacity, some now increased to 94, they proved invaluable on market days. In early 1958, new single destination boxes began to appear on the brush rail coaches in an attempt to match the Coronations and twin set. "167, now in use as a permanent way car, received an overall green livery in the winter of 1957-8. It was the only one of the class still on its original trucks. It seems to have proved a constant source of fascination for an army of small boys. The car was probably on a delivery run to collect stores from Rigby Road. On the standard front, 143 was converted into a somewhat unusual-looking double trolley overhead line car in August 1958. Renumbered 3, it was housed initially at Bispam. Also fitted with a diesel engine, it proved extremely flexible in dealing with a variety of emergencies. Travelling independently of the overhead, it could also generate power. Recognizing both its historic and financial potential, the country's last surviving open balcony tram still in public service was relicensed for a full year between 1957 and 1963. It immediately became a firm favourite with visiting enthusiasts and was the star attraction on a number of specially organised private tours. This, in company with number 41, was held in June 1958. Both cars have been built by the corporation in 1924-5. 41 being totally enclosed in 1930. Turning from Lytham Road into Station Road. Part of the fun was for tour cars to visit unfamiliar territory, and here the two standards are seen descending Dixon Road, having reversed at North Station. passing the long disused 1924 siding at the Gyn. A ride along Stargate and Squaresgate Lane was virtually obligatory for any enthusiast tour held in Blackpool between 1957 and 1961. Following an accident in late July 1960, 41 was broken up early the next year. This left just 7 standards available for service. Of which 48 was one of a pair of Motherwells, some bits of which were reputed to date back to 1902. .160 was one of a trio of surviving corporation-built cars from 1927. The Illuminated fleet still consisted of the 3 Old Faithfuls, all of which were nearing the end of their lives. Despite the chronic state of their electrics, Franklin had agreed, somewhat against his better judgment, to allow both the lifeboat and the gondola to carry fare-paying passengers. The tableau of the Mayflower, constructed on the offside of Progress, proved its undoing. The weight was too much for the flimsy support frame, and the car literally collapsed at the end of the 1958 season. Dressed in various guises, Progress had been in the Illuminated fleet from 1933 to 1938, and then during the war years had carried various patriotic slogans. Between 1949 and 1958, Progress had given pleasure to millions. But beneath all the trappings was the frame, trucks, motors and controllers of a veteran tramroad car of 1899. Continuing the North American connection, the Mayflower gave way to a Mississippi paddle steamer for the 1959 season. Great care was taken to create a nautical flavor, with the trolley mast being cunningly concealed in the funnel. As much needed revenue could be made by allowing people to travel in the Illuminated cars, the Blackpool Belle had provision for 32 passengers. The structure was built on the last intact 1927 tow track, 163. 2 sister cars had been acting as mobile television platforms, having been adapted for this role in 1951. At night, the Belle looked spectacular, with revolving fluorescent tubes simulating the movements of a ship's paddle wheels. As she sailed gracefully along the prom, music floating out from speakers concealed in one of the upper deck cabins. To create a couple more passenger-carrying premium fare Illuminated trams for the 1959 season, the 78-seater standards 158 and 159 were fitted with hundreds of coloured bulbs. Despite their newfound status, they still made regular appearances as extras. Here they are seen crossing the railway bridge on Lytham Road in the summer of 1959. "1960 was an important year in the history of the Blackpool Tramway, as it marked the 75th anniversary of continuous electric operation. For the many enthusiasts who travelled to the resort, a visit to the Pleasure Beach complex usually revealed something of rail-bound interest. For example, the miniature railway was worked by a steam-powered locomotive, vaguely reminiscent of an LMS 262 tank. For the really observant, there was a modern-looking four-wheel tram, locked forever onto its carousel circular. The 75th anniversary also coincided with delivery of the first of the 10 trailers built by MCW of Birmingham, the last arriving in January 1961. The undoubted highlight of 1960 was the restoration of 4 historic vehicles for the princely sum of just £700. After years in storage at Bispam, the 1885 conduit car travelled under its own power to emerge from the works as number 1 and bearing the inscription, "This is it." Dreadnought 59 of 1902 had languished in Copse Road since withdrawal in 1934, until overhauled and repainted in early 1960. The former Fleetwood rack of 1898 had survived following conversion to a snowplough in 1939. On the 5th of February, it had travelled under its own power from Copse Road to the works for restoration. The 1914 Fleetwood boxcar had been an active works tram since 1936, latterly serving as a staff restroom at Rigby Road. As with the others, the restoration work was essentially cosmetic, and the various liveries approximations. On the 9th of July, 3 of the cars carried scores of enthusiasts on a tour of the system. Number 1 was left at Bispam, while 2 and 59 proceeded on to Fleetwood. The Fleetwood rack had first made the same run 62 years previously, whilst the Dreadnought had never operated so far north in passenger service. Number 1 rejoins the tour, passing engineering car 3. and balcony 40. All the historic cars except number 1, which was relieved of any over-hectic activity, had to pay their way, and during the summer months they were frequently to be found on the Promenade Circular, which was specially created for the occasion. The tour cars loaded at Central Station. They then ran to Little Bispam, back to Pleasure Beach, before offloading once again at Central Station. Passengers were not allowed to get on or off en route. They also appeared as extras, and occasionally the old company duo would find themselves once again on the former tram road. 40 is probably working a Fleetwood Market Day special. Passengers gingerly descend the twin Shrewsbury staircases on number 59, and the elderly conductor claws his way back onto the platform. Collecting fares on the top deck of number 59. In fact, the Promenade Circular was something of a cheat, as it only lived up to its description when the cars rounded the loops at either end. The resuscitated circular tour made its last perambulations on the 9th of September 1960. The boat, having nudged out into Star Gate, the conductor off 158 resets the points for the main line. Then hangs the point iron on the adjacent traction pole. A circular tour car approaches the points and curves for St Anne's, abandoned in 1937, but still in situ. On the 15th of October, the 4 cars participated in a comprehensive tour organised by the Light Railway Transport League. History on wheels at Stargate. At this juncture, no one knew exactly what would happen to the restored cars. Conduit Car 1 again stopped at Bispam. The others reversed at Cleveley's Square. Passing through Bispam. To complete their survey, the tour party transferred from the old to the ultra-modern. For J.W. Fowler, founder of the Light Railway Transport League, the introduction of the twin set must have offered a glimmer of hope for the long-term future of electric traction. As costs continued to rise and passenger loadings to decline, public transport nationally was under increasing pressure. Even major railway facilities such as Blackpool's superbly located Central Station would disappear as part of the beaching plan. The fact that the station was conveniently situated adjacent to the Prom, the Tower and the Golden Mile seemed to count for nothing. The trams too remained under even closer economic scrutiny. In the rest of the country, despite some post-war modernisation, trams had already virtually disappeared from Britain. Dundee and Edinburgh had closed in 1956, Liverpool in 1957, Aberdeen in 58, Leeds in 59, and Sheffield, the last English city system, in 1960. This left only Glasgow, which would finally succumb in 1962. The Blackpool system had somehow seemed immune, but faced by these escalating costs, the repayment of the interest charges on the coronations, and the urgent need to renew worn-out track, the corporation had agreed that the Lytham Road route should be replaced by buses at the end of 1961. The Marton route was also in danger, but Franklin had managed to argue against the closure of Dixon Road as part of a highway scheme to alleviate congestion at Ginn Square. (1961) began with one improvement. To speed turnarounds at North Station, a trolley reverser was installed in January and the crossover relocated to outside the Odeon Cinema. A scheme to curtail the Marton cars outside St. John's Church was dropped, following opposition from the church authorities. The cutback would have eliminated these two right-angle bends. As well as the single-track approach to and from Talbot Square. Many enthusiasts believe the pantographs could have made their final appearances in 1960, but three of the class, 170, 172 and 175, deprived of their trolley rope so they could use the new North Station reverser, made their last passenger journeys over Easter 1961. A reminder of earlier days, with one of the last survivors offloading at the old terminus outside North Station. Several more Series 2 rail coaches were converted into towing cars during the course of 1961. Included was 275, which, having served as a trailer, was now reconverted back to a motor car. "274 was the last of the Series 2 rail coaches to be rebuilt as a towing car. The coronations began to appear in a simplified livery, omitting the broad green band above the windows, and later the glass roof panels were to be sheeted over to prevent leaking. And to reduce overall weight, the heavy steel body panels were replaced by aluminium. The remaining standards were still faithfully pressed into service at times of peak demand. This one is swallowing up a queue at Pleasure Beach. On a short working to cabin. The historic cars now gathered dust in Martin Depot for most of the year, although the Dreadnought was hired by the Daily Mirror. It was not until 1909 that corporation cars had begun to operate regularly to Squires Gate. Prior to this, the route had been worked mainly by the various tramways serving St Anne's and Lytham. Now the 2-mile route was to be replaced by buses as from the 30th of October 1961. During the final summer, it was served by single-deckers operating to Bispam and by double-deckers to Cabin, both on a 10-minute headway. Arrivals and departures were regulated by means of the Bundy clock. The conductress was probably one of the 350 female platform staff recruited during the war. The single-deckers allocated to Bispam Depot carried the numbers 51 to 57, and the double-deckers 58 to 63. During the off-season, the line was the preserve of single-deckers operating from Rigby Road Depot. It was a typical residential route with frequent stops. During the war, it had carried very heavy traffic out to the airfield at Squires Gate and the Vickers factory, which had built Wellington bombers. crossing Highfield Road, where there was also a short working crossover. The run to the prom was virtually dead straight for 1.5 miles, with the tower acting as a kind of beacon. By the end, the rails laid in 1938 were in shocking condition. The trams were running partly on their flanges, and as a result, this caused the pattern of corrugation on the tread to be repeated on the groove. The only feature of any note was the steeply graded skew bridge over the railway. Looked at from the right angle, it was just possible to glimpse daylight beneath the trams as they crested the hump of the bridge. The grade was 1 in 16, the steepest encountered by the Blackpool trams. The coronations never operated on Lytham Road, owing to the curve of the bridge and the problems of a long 50-foot car cresting the top. On certain days, the handful of remaining standards could be seen in numbers. In the distance, a Martin car turns out of Station Road, having come inland from South Pier. This had marked the original interchange point between the corporation trams and the Lytham Company cars. Station Road was also to be abandoned, effectively depriving the Martin route of its additional summer traffic from South Pier. Before turning off Lytham Road, the South Pier cars waited in the middle of the road whilst the conductor first changed the points from a slot in the pavement, and then held the overhead frog, allowing the car to turn west. Also, cars were forbidden to pass on these curves, which is why the inbound car is waiting in Station Road. South Shore Terminus. Station Road had been the last conduit extension opened in 1897. Rejoining Lytham Road. Manoeuvres through the extremely busy intersection at the Royal Oak were partially alleviated during the season by the use of a points boy, who controlled the movements of the cars turning from Lytham Road into Waterloo Road. The triangular junction, relayed as late as 1958, was in use for only 4 years. Every third car from Martin continued to South Shore during the season, providing a 9-minute headway. The first bend of any significance since Squires Gate was just north of Bloomfield Road, home of Blackpool Football Club. Manchester Square. The tracks from here back to Hopton Road would be retained for access to the depot and works. Aware that Blackpool's town routes were to close, increasing numbers of enthusiast tours were organised. Pantograph 170 was brought out of retirement to operate this special on October the 15th. It covered all the sections scheduled to close in a couple of weeks. South Shore. The pantographs had never operated in service on the Martin route. "170 became a works car in January 1962, a role it continued to play until transformed into HMS Blackpool in 1965. Rounding the curve onto Lytham Road. On the last day of Lytham Road, Balcony 40 took part in a farewell tour. Cautiously turning from Lytham Road into Station Road. On its way for an historic last journey. 40 was to become the last Blackpool car to make its way along Star Gate. Through the fossilized remains of the triangular junction laid in 1928, which should have carried rail coaches into the centre of St Anne's. And over the Squires Gate Lane railway bridge, widened and relaid with double track as late as 1932. On the final day, the passenger service was worked entirely by rail coaches. It was the impact of these streamlined single-deckers which had prevented closure of the route in 1936. Now it was to be the first post-war abandonment in Blackpool. The last car from Squires Gate to Bispam was 268, and the last to Cabin, 201. The following day, the trams were superseded by bus route 12. "1961 also witnessed the loss of another old favourite, the lifeboat, which had been built on the frame of Martin Boxcar 40 in 1926. Never quite as eye-catching as the gondola, it was nevertheless painted in authentic lifeboat livery, and its sail of coloured lights could be turned to face the direction of travel. As if pointing to an optimistic future, she was replaced by the Rocket, which was built incorporating parts from pantograph car 168. She was single-ended, passengers entering through the rocket exhaust and sitting at an elevation of 20 degrees. This most unusual and futuristic addition to the fleet was given the name Tramnik 1, being a land-bound version of the Russian Sputnik. The story of Blackpool trams from 1962 to 1995 will be told in Blackpool Trams Part 2.
Well, it's your old mate Dave Spencer back with you again. How did you enjoy that nostalgia fest, courtesy of the Online Transport Archive, the OTA? And it's been a pleasure to bring these scenes to you. And our thanks once again for Martin and Wilf agreeing to pass the copyright on for the productions down to the OTA. And as I said at the beginning, the OTA working very hard to preserve both still and moving images. And if you know of anybody who has collections, particularly of transport, whether it be buses, trams, trains, trolley buses, lorries, yes, we can provide a safe home for them. So just get in touch with ourselves direct and we'll put you on to the OTA people. Right, so that's it. And it's been a pleasure having you along. And from me, Dave Spencer, bye for now. See you all again soon. Bye-bye.